This video is to replace the vertical bearing shaft. So first thing we did is we blocked the beam so that it can't fall. The procedure is to remove the 8 fasteners that hold the 2 bearings in place. All right, the first bearing is loose, so we'll just move it out of the way and rest it at the bottom. All right. Remove the upper bearing. So now the top bearing is free, so we're just going to move that one down to the bottom. Rest it at the bottom. Now we'll remove the shaft fasteners at the top. Two on the top and 2 on the bottom. The top is now free, and moving the fasteners on the bottom. So now that all the fasteners are removed, you can just pull the whole assembly out. There, now we have the whole assembly removed. Now that the shaft is removed, what we have to do is make sure that these 2 bearing blocks are perfectly in line and parallel, and that's most likely the problem that caused the damage to the shaft, is that these are not perfectly in line. So to realign those, we have to remove the motor and the gearbox so that we can get at the fasteners that hold the 2 blocks to the beam. Okay, so now we have the 4 screws that hold the motor to the gearbox removed, and now the motor can be pulled straight off of the gearbox. Next we have to remove the gearbox from the block, and that's done by removing the 2 screws that were behind the bearing block on this side, and then there are 2 screws on the other side that you can access. All 4 mounting bolts are removed from the plate that go into the reducer, the gear reducer, so now we can just pull the gearbox straight off the shaft. So now we have to remove this plate to access bolts that are underneath that hold our blocks, bearing blocks, to the beam. So we're going to remove these 8 fasteners to remove this plate. Okay, by cutting the zip ties here, we were able to get the plate over the shaft, so we didn't have to unwire all of this. You may not be so fortunate. You might actually have to unwire these to be able to get the plate off of the shaft so that you can expose the bolts that we need to loosen to true up the 2 bearing blocks. So now we have access to the 3 bolts that mount the bearing block, the top and the bottom, to the beam plate. These we have to true up so that the bearings are parallel and in line with each other. So we're going to take a straight edge and just check the alignment and make sure that they're perfectly parallel. As you can see, these are. If they're not parallel, we'll have to loosen the 3 bolts in each of these bearing block holders and true them up, and then re-tighten them down. So once we have our 2 blocks, our 2 bearing blocks aligned to each other so that they're nice and in line, now we just go through the reassembly process, put everything back, and then we can mount our bearings and the new shaft into the machine. So as you reassemble, you'll want to put Loctite on all of these fasteners. We use the removable type or the blue type. Go ahead.
To center the plate on the shaft, you have to slide the gearbox on, and then that locates the shaft in relation to the shaft. And then you can tighten the bolts that you have access to, and that'll locate the plate correctly
To the gearbox.
And then you can remove the gearbox and install the remaining bolts.
All right, so now we're just tightening down the plate the remaining fasteners. And then we can reinstall the gearbox. So now we're reinstalling the gearbox. Reinstall the 4 fasteners that hold the gearbox to the gearbox plate. The gearbox is back on. Now we'll put the motor back on and reattach it to the gearbox with the 4 fasteners. And we are Loctiting these as well. All the fasteners that were removed are re-Loctited before installation. The gearbox, servo motor all put back in. Now we'll mount the rail, bearing rail. Slide it all in. And we have the 4 fasteners, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom to hold the rail in place. With the screws just partially in, you can move the bearing blocks back into place. Bolt them in. Now, after that's all bolted up, we'll position the shaft to set the backlash between the pinion gear and the rack. We don't have the bolts in the bottom right now. It just allows us to provide clearance to get the bearings in up against the bearing block mounts. Now the bearing blocks are tight, and now we'll just snug up the shaft mounts on the bottom and then the top. And then we'll go into how do you set the proper lash between the pinion and the rack once we get these tight. So now we're going to set the backlash. So Dan's gonna lift it, and you should be able to feel some play and possibly hear some clicking so that you know there's some play between the pinion gear and the rack. And now if there isn't any, or if there's an appropriate amount, which is kind of a touch and feel thing, there's not really a measurement. Dan will explain how he adjusts this.
What you want to do is you want to loosen these 2 bolts. And that'll allow the shaft and the beam to move in and out. And what you can do is put a screwdriver between the standoff and the upright, and then you can see a little bit of movement. You want to get it so it's close, and just a little bit of movement up and down.
So it's a bit of a trial and error process. So you
That's too much.
Hear the clicking, that was too much.
Once you have the backlash set, you can leave the screwdriver in and then tighten the screws. And then once you have the screws tight, you can pull the screwdriver out.
You can try it again and see if you
Double check the backlash.
can kind of hear a little ticking. At least we can, to verify that you have some room between the pinion gear and the rack. It shouldn't be a super tight fit. There should be some movement up and down of the pinion in the rack. So then we have to go down, jog this down, and then do the bottom. And it's loosening up the bottom mount of the shaft, and using the same screwdriver trick, he can kind of get the backlash where he wants it, and then tighten down the bolts. and then check it again and see what we get. And there you go, you got a little bit of play. And that's what you're looking for. So now we have the gear lash set on the top and bottom. If you want to, we do it additionally, we go and we check gear lash at each of the connection points, the bolts that hold the rack on. You may not need to do this, but it's just a procedure that we go through. So now you should be all set. Things should run true. We shouldn't have any of that following error fault because we're binding in between the pinion gear and the rack, and it probably was a result of these bearings not being perfectly aligned, and that's probably what caused the damage to the shaft and is causing the problem with the over current or the following error problem.